a weary farmer gave shelter to a lost traveler on a stormy night. A week later, a convoy of black SUVs arrived at his doorstep. What they revealed would change his life forever. Hey everyone, welcome to Legacy Tales. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe, because what happened on Jacob Turner's farm that week was something no one could have predicted. Let's get started. The rain was relentless, hammering against the old wooden barn as thunder rumbled in the distance. Jacob Turner, a weary farmer in his late 60s, tightened his coat against the cold night air. He had just finished checking on his livestock when something made him stop. A faint sound, barely audible over the storm. He turned toward the barn, his lantern casting flickering shadows across the damp earth. Inside, curled up in the hay, was a man. His clothes were soaked, his face pale with exhaustion. He wasn't from around here. Jacob could tell that much. His hands, though roughened by travel, lacked the calluses of a laborer. He looked up, startled but too weak to rise. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jacob sighed. "Storm's bad tonight. You can stay." By morning, the rain had passed, but the stranger still lay motionless in the barn, his breath shallow. Jacob wasn't one to pry, but something about this man told him he wasn't just some drifter. He moved with caution, like someone accustomed to watching his back. When Jacob set down a plate of eggs and bread, the man finally stirred, his eyes filled with something between gratitude and hesitation. "I'll be on my way soon," he muttered. Jacob shrugged. "No rush. Looks like you've been through worse than a storm." The man didn't respond. Instead, he ate slowly, as if savoring every bite. Jacob noticed his clothes, expensive fabric, now torn and muddied. The way he held himself, even in exhaustion, was different. This wasn't a man used to sleeping in barns. Jacob let him be. He had no use for questions that weren't ready to be answered. But deep down, he knew, whoever this man was, he wasn't running from the weather. He was running from something much bigger. The sun had barely risen when Jacob stepped out onto his porch, stretching his stiff joints. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and fresh. As he made his way to the barn, he spotted his neighbor, Tom Wilkins, leaning against the fence. A burly man in his 50s, Tom was the kind of friend who always had an opinion, whether you asked for it or not. "You got company?" Tom nodded toward the barn, chewing on a piece of straw. Jacob sighed. "Just a traveler. Got caught in the storm." Tom raised an eyebrow. "That's so?" "Strange times, Jacob. You never know who's who these days." Jacob didn't respond. He knew Tom meant well, but the world hadn't made him suspicious just yet. Instead, he walked back to the barn, where the traveler was now awake, sitting on the edge of the hay pile. His face was still pale, but there was more color in his cheeks now. "I never asked your name," Jacob said, setting a fresh cup of coffee on a wooden crate beside him. The man hesitated before answering. "Daniel?" He reached for the cup, his fingers trembling slightly. "Just Daniel." Jacob nodded. He'd lived long enough to recognize when someone was hiding something, but he also knew that sometimes a man needed time before he was ready to talk. Just then, the barn doors creaked open, and Jacob's daughter, Emily, stepped inside, carrying a small basket. A strong-willed woman in her late 20s, Emily had grown up on the farm, learning the trade just as her mother had before her. She paused when she saw Daniel, her sharp green eyes scanning him carefully. "This the man you mentioned?" she asked, setting the basket down. Jacob nodded. Emily, this is Daniel. He'll be staying for a bit. Emily didn't look convinced. I brought some fresh clothes. Figured he might need them. Daniel glanced at the bundle of neatly folded garments. For a moment, he looked as if he might refuse, but then he nodded in quiet appreciation. Thank you. Emily didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied him again, her arms crossed. You don't seem like the usual type we get passing through. Jacob shot her a look, but Daniel only gave a faint smile. I suppose I'm not. The air was thick with unspoken words, but before anyone could say more, a truck rolled up the dirt road, its tires kicking up dust. Jacob recognized it immediately. It was Sheriff Mason's truck. A straight-laced man in his 50s, the sheriff had been around long enough to know when something was out of place, and Jacob had no doubt that Tom had already run his mouth about the traveler in the barn. The sheriff stepped out, adjusting his belt. Morning, Jacob. Morning, Sheriff. Mason glanced at the barn, then back at Jacob. Heard you had a visitor. Jacob crossed his arms. Word travels fast. Mason sighed. Not trying to stir anything, Jacob. Just checking in. Had a call from Tom. Said there's a stranger on your property, and with the way things have been lately, folks get nervous. Jacob held his ground. Man's just resting. That a crime now? Mason studied him for a long moment, then nodded. No crime in kindness. He turned to Daniel, his expression unreadable. But you understand why people ask questions, don't you? Daniel met his gaze evenly. I do. The sheriff seemed to weigh his words before tipping his hat. You be careful, Jacob. Then, without another word, he climbed back into his truck and drove off. As the dust settled, Emily exhaled sharply. This isn't over. Jacob glanced at Daniel. He could see it now, the tension in the way Daniel held himself, the way his eyes flicked toward the road, as if expecting someone else to arrive. He wasn't just running. He was hiding. And Jacob had just made the choice to stand between him and whatever was coming next. The days passed quietly, but the feeling of something unseen lingered in the air. Daniel kept to himself, helping Jacob with small tasks around the farm, but there was always a weight in his eyes, a burden he carried alone. Emily remained cautious, watching him from a distance, but even she couldn't deny that he was a hard worker. Then, on the 7th day, everything changed. A sleek black car rolled up the dirt path, its tires barely making a sound against the gravel. Jacob wiped the sweat from his brow, exchanging a glance with Emily. This wasn't a neighbor, and it sure wasn't the sheriff. The car came to a stop, and as the door opened, a tall man in a crisp suit stepped out, his expression unreadable. Jacob felt Daniel tense beside him. The man approached with measured steps, removing his sunglasses. Mr. Anderson, he asked, looking at Jacob before his gaze shifted to Daniel. Or should I say, Mr. Laurent? Daniel inhaled sharply, his fists clenching. Jacob glanced between them. What's this about? The man exhaled, his voice calm but firm. My name is Michael Carter. I represent the U.S. State Department. The man you've been sheltering is not just a traveler. He's a diplomat, one whose life has been in danger since the moment he set foot on American soil. Jacob's eyes widened. Emily took an unconscious step closer to him. Michael continued. There was an attempt on his life before he arrived here. He disappeared without a trace, and for the past week we've been searching for him. The people who want him dead are dangerous, and by keeping him hidden, you've put yourself in the middle of something much larger than you realize. Jacob turned to Daniel, his voice quiet but steady. Is this true? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. I didn't want to involve you. I never meant to put you in harm's way. Silence stretched between them before Jacob finally sighed. Harm's way or not, you were just a man in need. That was enough for me. Michael's expression softened. Not many would have done what you did, Mr. Anderson. Emily folded her arms. So what happens now? Daniel looked at Jacob, a flicker of something, gratitude, regret, passing through his eyes. Now, I leave. Jacob swallowed hard. He had known from the start that Daniel wouldn't stay, but that didn't make it easier. Daniel stepped forward, extending a hand. I don't have the words to thank you, Jacob, but I won't forget this. Jacob shook his hand firmly. Then make it count. Whatever it is you're fighting for, make it worth something. A shadow of a smile crossed Daniel's face. I will. Minutes later, he was gone, disappearing into the black car that carried him back to a life far beyond the quiet fields of Jacob's farm. As Jacob stood on his porch, watching the dust settle in the wake of Daniel's departure, Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing. Jacob exhaled, nodding slowly. Sometimes the right thing ain't the easy thing. He turned back to the farm, the place he had always known, the land that had seen generations come and go. Life would go on, as it always had. But in the quiet of the fields, in the rustling of the wheat, Jacob knew some acts of kindness carried farther than a man could ever see. If you believe kindness still matters in this world, hit that like button and subscribe to Legacy Tales for more stories that touch the heart. And tell us, what would you have done in Jacob's place? Let us know in the comments below.